everybody, welcome back to my studio and welcome to my second mini PL session. So if you had a chance to watch my first PL session, you know that I chatted a little bit about what to include in a piece of written documentation. And so today I thought that I would chat a little bit about photo selection and some aesthetic considerations when creating a piece of documentation. Because as we chatted about before, you know, when we create a piece of written documentation, it's not about a recounting of events or a recounting of an experience that happened and saying, oh, look how cute the children looked when they were engaged in this activity, but pedagogical documentation is so much deeper than that. And it's really about us giving visibility to children's thinking, their ideas, their theories, the things that they're questioning, the things that they're wondering, the ideas that they're trying out. And so when we think about our written documentation, the photos that we choose to accompany our written piece of documentation is so important, because it's going to help tell the children's story. And so we really want to give careful thought to the photos that we select and that we include in our pieces of written documentation, and not just see them as you know, a space filler or an add-on or something that we kind of do after, say, okay, you know, here's a photo that shows this happening or something like that, and people will know what's happening in the photo because of what I've written. So we want to think really carefully about the photos that we select. So some things that I just thought that I would share a little bit about some things that you want to consider when you're choosing photos for a written piece of documentation. So firstly, you want to make sure that you choose, that you don't have too many photos. Too many photos can be really overwhelming to look at, and can often cause the reader to not really know what to look at, and then in that case they just kind of don't look at them altogether, and either maybe don't read your piece of documentation or maybe just skim it very quickly. So you want to be careful not to have too many photos or too small photos. If they're too small, then again, people aren't going to really be able to see what you're wanting them to see. So you want to make sure that you have photos that are of a good size and that aren't too many. And then you also want to think about, you know, if you don't have the right photos, which is why I'm chatting about this, if you don't have the right photos, children's ideas and their theories and their thinking and what you're trying to communicate can be minimized or can be lost. So some things that you want to maybe ask yourself when you're choosing which photos you want to include in your documentation is, what do I want to show? Sounds simple, but it can be really challenging sometimes. So think about, you know, when you take a photo, you might not want to show the entire photo. You might want to, if you're not sure how to crop a photo, you know, ask a colleague to show you how to crop a photo. You might want to crop just part of that photo to show what you're trying to show. You know, perhaps it's how the children were working with their hands, or it's how it's a facial expression that was really important, or it's how their feet were doing something, or running, or jumping, or something that is in the background you don't want to show, or you don't want people to focus on, because everything that is in a photo people are going to see and people are going to look at. So if you're wanting to focus on one particular thing, consider cropping the photo to show just the part that you're trying to show, which will help illustrate your story and the children's thinking a little bit better. Now, sometimes when you're going through your photos and you're trying to select a photo for a piece of documentation, you might say, you know what, I don't have a photo that really shows what I'm trying to show. And so in that case, that's really good self-reflection to think about, okay, how am I going to be intentional and more mindful next time I take photos to really capture what I want to capture, and not just take a photo for the sake of taking a photo of, okay, the children are engaged in this, I'm just going to snap a photo really quickly. But it can be good reflection to think, okay, what is it about this experience that I really want to try and capture? And maybe you have to take 15 or 20 photos and then be able to look back at them and crop them, but it can be really good reflection. So don't worry if you look on if you're writing a piece of documentation right now and you look at your photos and say, I don't have anything that captures what I'm trying to say. Don't worry, that's a really good piece of reflection, and it's a really good starting point to say, okay, next time I'm looking at an experience and thinking, you know, I think this might be something that I'm going to write a piece of documentation about. You can kind of think back and think about, okay, how am I going to really be mindful about the photos that I take, knowing that I'm going to really want to show something particular with those photos. The other thing is, what do I want people to notice? And again, this goes back to the idea of how many photos you choose. And so I would think about, you know, what's the fewest number of photos that I can use to really show my point. Sometimes, when you've been working on it for a while, you can just get one photo that can really capture exactly what you're wanting to show, or maybe 2 or 3. But really challenge yourself to tell your story in the fewest number of photos possible, so that people can really zero in on, this is the idea that the person who wrote the piece of documentation is wanting me to think about. Because again, when there's too many photos, or too small photos, people don't really know what to look at, and then your story or the children's ideas can be lost. So challenge yourself to say, how can I tell this story in as few a number of photos as possible, and how can those photos that I do choose be really intentional and really specific to what it is that I'm telling. And then to also ask yourself, which photo best communicates the children's thinking. And again, this goes back to maybe cropping the photo, or maybe noticing what's happening in the background of a photo that you've taken, because maybe something is happening in the background that you hadn't noticed when you first took the photo, but later as you go back to tell a story, you realize that it becomes really important in the story, and so that becomes a really great photo. And the other thing is, so once you've decided on your photos, you put them into your text, ask a colleague to tell you what they see in the photos that you've selected, because it's really great to have another person's perspective. What you see in the photos is coming from what happened in the experience, because you wrote it. But when you ask another person, say, what do you see in these photos? It's really good to hear from them, from their perspective, what they see. That way it gives you an idea of whether you're communicating what it is that you're hoping to communicate through the photos. So lastly, I just want to encourage you to remember that your photos in your piece of documentation should bring the text to life. It shouldn't just be an add-on, or shouldn't just be something that you kind of put in there really quickly, but it's really a key piece of telling your story. If anything, I would say it's one of the most important pieces, because when you have a piece of written documentation, and we talked a little bit about the importance of a good title in my first session, but the title and the photos is really what's going to draw the reader in to actually read the text that you've written. So if you have too many photos, or you have a really vague title or not a specific title, the chances of people actually reading the thought maybe that you put into your piece of documentation, or understanding the children's thinking or ideas that you're trying to communicate, might be lost. So give a lot of thought to the title, give a lot of thought to the photos, and be really intentional about what you choose. The other thing I want to mention really quickly too, and this is maybe a little bit different for a display, so I'm talking more about a piece of written documentation that you might offer in a binder to show back to the children, or something a little bit smaller than kind of a display that you would see on the wall, something like this behind me. But you want to make sure that you typically have the photos on a neutral background, not on something that is really bright, not to have really flashy lettering. Why? Because that takes away from, again, the story that you're trying to tell. It takes away from the children's photos. You want people to focus on the photos and what's happening and the story that you're trying to tell, instead of a really bright background or really fancy lettering. Those are great for scrapbooking, but scrapbooking isn't the same as pedagogical documentation. Pedagogical documentation is showing children's thinking and ideas and theories, and so you want that to be the focus. You don't want that to be lost with too busy a background. So try and keep your pieces of documentation, have a neutral background, and if you do have design elements in it, be really thoughtful and really mindful about what those design elements are going to be and how they're going to enhance the children's thinking and ideas that you're trying to communicate, instead of it just being something that's there to make it look pretty, because save that for scrapbooking. So I hope that this has been helpful. Again, if you'd like to chat more, you're working on documentation, or you have questions about documentation, or you have questions about anything really related to pedagogy, how does learning happen, I'd love to chat more with you. Send me an email at victoria@sbsconsulting.ca, or again, send me a little message in the text box below, and I'd love to connect with you guys. Hope you guys have a wonderful day, and stay tuned for my next video. Take care.